The sky over the Japanese archipelago did not darken gradually through the accumulation of clouds, but died in a single suffocating instant of absolute negation. It was noon in Musutafu, when the sunlight simply ceased to reach the pavement, intercepted by a sudden and viscous barrier in the upper atmosphere that defied every meteorological model possessed by the Hero Society. There was no sound of thunder and no warning from the seismic sensors that monitored the ring of fire. Only a collective gasp from millions of civilians as the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in seconds. The silence that followed was not the quiet of peace, but the biological terror of prey, realizing the predator is already inside the den. Automated streetlights flickered on and immediately shattered, their filaments overwhelmed by a sudden surge of unfamiliar electromagnetic static that screamed through the power grid. In the frantic darkness, the only illumination came from the desperate activation of thousands of quirks, a galaxy of panicked fires, lightning bolts, and bioluminescent skin lighting up the streets like a constellation of fear. This was not a villain attack. This was not a coordinated strike by the League of Villains or a machination of All for One. This was a planetary siege initiated by an entity that did not recognize the concept of heroes or laws. High above the panicked screams of the Shibuya crossing, the barrier descended. It was not smoke or ash, but a living ocean of symbiote matter, a cohesive darkness that dripped from the exosphere like oil in water. The number one hero, Endeavor, was the first to realize the scale of the threat. As he launched himself from the roof of his agency, his flames roaring to life in a desperate attempt to pierce the gloom. He treated the phenomenon as a physical obstruction, a massive quirk effect that could be burned away with sufficient heat. He was wrong. His prominence burn, a technique capable of incinerating high-end Nomu at the cellular level, spiraled upward into the descending abyss. The spectators on the ground watched in horror as the hellfire did not disperse the darkness, but was swallowed by it. The flames were not extinguished by lack of oxygen. They were strangled by a superior will. The darkness reacted to the thermal energy not as matter, but as an immune system reacting to a virus. The fire was consumed, and in its place, the darkness pulsed and solidified. From the bleeding sky, the first wave of Grendels detached themselves. They were colossal dragons of shifting obsidian slime, their wingspans eclipsing city blocks, their faces devoid of eyes but filled with rows of jagged white teeth that spiraled down their throats. They did not roar with vocal cords, but emitted a psychic screech that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the primal hindbrain of every living creature in the blast radius. Pro-heroes who stood their ground found their knees buckling not from physical force, but from a sudden crushing weight on their consciousness. The abyss was heavy. It carried the mass of 1 billion conquered worlds. Ryukyu, in her full dragon form, rose to meet the first descending beast, her claws reinforced by the finest support items Japan could produce. The collision shattered windows for 3 miles. The comic logic of a hero world, where will and training could overcome physical limits, crashed violently against the cosmic horror of Knull's vanguard. Ryukyu's scales, tough enough to withstand artillery, were sheared through like wet paper by the Grendel's claws. The symbiote dragon did not just bite her, it infected her. The impact of the invasion was immediate and total. The darkness was not just a physical substance, but a metaphysical corruption. As the Grendel sludge splattered across the commercial district, it did not pool on the ground. It hunted. It sought out biological matter, sensing the genetic distinctiveness of quirks. To the hive mind, a quirk factor was a vibrant, chaotic anomaly that needed to be silenced. Civilians who were touched by the raining oil did not just suffocate. They changed, their skin bleach white or turned obsidian, their eyes vanishing behind swirling spirals of red. The quirk singularity theory, which posited that powers would one day become too complex for humanity to control, was rendered obsolete in seconds. The complexity did not matter. The darkness simplified everything. It rewrote the genetic code of the victims, turning distinct individuals into hollow vessels for the voice of the king in black. The global communication networks began to fracture as the darkness tightened its grip around the planet's orbit, severing satellite uplinks. The last images to broadcast on the giant screens of Times Square and Piccadilly Circus were of the Japanese skyline being swallowed by a tidal wave of living shadow. In the principal's office at UA High, the defensive shutters slammed closed, but the strategic monitors showed red warnings across every sector. Nezu, a being of hyper-intelligence who could calculate the trajectory of falling debris and the economic fallout of a villain fight simultaneously, stared at the data with a freezing realization. The variables were not making sense. The energy readings from the sky were not biological or technological. They were ancient. The logic of the world had broken. This was not a battle for society. It was an extinction event. And out in the void, sitting upon a throne of dead stars, Knull sensed the flickering lights of one for all and all for one, not as threats, but as candles waiting to be snuffed out. The blackout that descended upon the Japanese archipelago was absolute and suffocating, a physical weight that pressed against the chest of every living creature within the quarantine zone. This was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of a primordial void that actively consumed photons, dampening the bioluminescence of panic and the desperate flares of quirks in the streets of Musutafu. The transition from a Tuesday afternoon to a prehistoric nightmare took less than 60 seconds, shattering the illusion of safety provided by the pro-hero system. The air grew thick and oily, smelling of ozone and wet ash, a scent that triggered a deep reptilian fear in the civilian populace. Panic did not spread like wildfire. It detonated. The disciplined evacuation protocols that had been drilled into the population since elementary school disintegrated instantly, because the threat did not follow the geometry of a villain attack. There was no epicenter to run from. The sky itself was falling. On the ground, the initial response from the police force and local heroes was brave, coordinated, and utterly futile. Death Arms, a hero known for immense physical strength, stood at the intersection of a major shopping district, holding up a collapsing pedestrian bridge that had been sheared by the tail of a passing Grendel. He shouted orders to the fleeing crowd, his voice straining against the unnatural roar of the wind. He was a veteran of catastrophic events, accustomed to the logic of disaster where debris fell down and people ran away, but the debris here was alive. The concrete slab he held aloft suddenly grew veins of black slime, the inanimate matter infected by the spillover from the atmosphere. The bridge did not just crumble, it liquefied and reformed. Death Arms looked up just as the concrete wrapped around his forearms, not crushing him, but binding him. The symbiote matter, recognizing the density of his muscle fibers and the potency of his strength-enhancing quirk, bypassed his skin and drove tendrils directly into his nervous system. His scream was cut short as the sludge flooded his throat, and seconds later, the hero who had saved 100 lives turned his massive fists against the crowd he was protecting. The symbol of safety became a siege weapon for the invader. At the UA High School campus, the fortress on the hill, the UA barrier system activated automatically. Massive plates of reinforced steel slammed shut over windows and blast doors sealed the corridors turning the school into a bunker. Inside the faculty office, Eraserhead stared at the monitors, his bloodshot eyes widening as he watched the tactical feeds go dark one by one. The sensors were not just losing signal, they were reporting biological consumption. The cameras showed distorted glimpses of the school grounds being carpeted in a writhing black ocean. He grabbed the emergency microphone, broadcasting to all hero courses. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing through a catalogue of villains, finding no match. This was not All for One. This was not the Liberation Army. He ordered Class 1A and 1B to suit up and muster in the gymnasium, designated as the primary defensible point. He knew, with a cold certainty, that the walls would not hold. The enemy was not knocking. It was osmosis. In the heights of the 1A dormitory, Izuku Midoriya collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. The danger sense quirk, usually a sharp stab of warning, had become a continuous blinding migraine that threatened to shatter his consciousness. It was not registering a specific attack. It was registering the hostility of the environment itself. The vestiges within One for All were screaming, not in words, but in a chaotic transmission of ancient fear. Nana Shimura's spirit wept, and the first user, Yoichi, projected a sense of dread so profound it felt like freezing water in Izuku's veins. They recognized the signature of the enemy not from their own history, but from the genetic memory of the universe itself. This was an ancient predator. Izuku forced himself to stand, his breath hitching, green lightning crackling erratically around his body. He looked at Bakugo, who was staring out the window at the abyss with a rare expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. Bakugo's hands sparked with small, nervous explosions, his instincts demanding a target. But the target was everything. The first breach of the UA defenses occurred at the main gate. The heavy titanium barriers, designed to withstand ballistic missiles and gigantification quirks, began to scream as they were torn apart at the molecular level. A Grendel dragon, smaller than the ones in the upper atmosphere but still the size of a bus, crashed through the defenses, its body a swirling mass of teeth and hate. It did not move like an animal. It moved like a liquid projectile. The UA, security robots, the zero-pointers, and the patrol drones engaged immediately. Their machine guns and lasers struck the beast, but the lasers were absorbed into the black hide, fueling it, and the bullets simply vanished into the viscous mass. The dragon swept its tail, decapitating a row of robots, and then vomited a torrent of living sludge onto the campus lawn. From the sludge rose humanoid figures, the symbiote soldiers, lacking faces but wielding weapons formed from their own limbs. They sprinted toward the dormitories with silent, terrifying speed. Shota Aizawa was the first faculty member to engage. He launched himself from the second-floor balcony, his capture weapon unfurling like a grey snake. He landed in the path of the advancing horde, his eyes glowing red as he activated erasure. He locked his gaze on the leading creatures, expecting their forms to destabilize, their speed to drop, their biological quirks to vanish. Nothing happened. The soldiers did not slow down. Aizawa's heart skipped a beat. Erasure worked by severing the connection between the user's quirk factor and their body. These creatures had no quirk factor. They were not using genetic abilities. They were biology weaponized by a cosmic god. The laws of the My Hero Academia universe, where every power had a genetic switch, had just been violated. Aizawa barely dodged a razor-sharp axe formed from a soldier's arm, realizing too late that his primary weapon was useless. He was fighting blindly against a power system he couldn't deconstruct. The students of Class 1A burst from the dormitory entrance, led by Tenya Aida, whose engines roared with blue flame. They formed a defensive perimeter around Aizawa. Shoto Todoroki wasted no time, unleashing a massive ridge of ice to wall off the approaching tide. The ice froze the first wave of symbiotes, trapping them in a glacial prison. For a moment it seemed to work, but then the black matter began to vibrate. Cracks appeared in the ice, not from impact, but from corruption. The symbiotes were eating the thermal energy, consuming the cold itself. The ice turned grey, then black, and shattered outward, the shards transforming into projectiles that rained back down on the students. Bakugo launched himself into the air, screaming a defiance that masked his terror, and unleashed a howitzer impact directly into the center of the mass. The explosion was blinding, a sphere of pure destruction that vaporized the pavement and incinerated the front line of the monsters. But as the smoke cleared, the scattered droplets of black goo simply rolled back together, reforming into larger, angrier shapes. The blast had not hurt them. It had merely scattered the hive, which immediately signaled for reinforcements. Meanwhile, miles away in the Tartarus prison facility, a different kind of horror was unfolding. The automated defense systems, detecting the atmospheric breach, had gone into total lockdown. Deep in the lowest level, All for One sat in his chair, bound by sensors and guns. He could feel the presence. It was a hunger that eclipsed his own. For the first time in a century, the demon lord of the underworld felt like a small fish in a dark ocean. He sensed his other self, Shigaraki, out in the world, and he felt the connection wavering. The symbiote hive mind was interfering with the radio waves of their psychic link. The darkness was jamming him. The prison walls shuddered as something massive landed on the facility's roof above the water. The Grendels had found the highest concentration of powerful quirks. They were not here to liberate, they were here to harvest. The lights in Tartarus died, and the emergency red strobes began to pulse. The sound of tearing metal echoed down the elevator shaft. All for One smiled in the dark, a smile devoid of humor. He realized that the game board he had been manipulating for decades had just been flipped over by a player who didn't care about the pieces. Back in the city, the chaos had evolved into a slaughter. The pro-heroes were falling. Kamui Woods, attempting to restrain a group of possessed civilians, found his wooden limbs infected by the symbiote. The wood rotted instantly, and the infection traveled up his arms. He severed his own limbs to save his torso, retreating to a rooftop, watching as the civilians he tried to save morphed into feral beasts that began climbing the walls with spider-like agility. Mount Lady, having grown to giant size to act as a barricade, was now a massive target. Swarms of smaller symbiotes covered her like ants on a fallen beetle. She thrashed and screamed, her titanic strength useless against an enemy that flowed like water and cut like diamond. Her screams were cut short as the black matter covered her face, silencing her. The tragic reality of the Quirk Society was being laid bare. Their powers were designed for policing, for duels, for rescue. They were not designed for war against a viral cosmology. It was in this moment of collapsing order that the first dimensional variance was detected by the world's greatest intelligence, though not a human one. In the Marvel Universe, specifically Earth 616, within the Baxter Building, the interdimensional seismographs flared red. Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, looked up from his console. The readings indicated a massive necrotic incursion in a neighboring reality, a timeline designated as Earth MHA. The signature was unmistakable. Knull. The King in Black had found a backdoor into a universe rich in biological superpowers, but completely lacking in cosmic defenses. Reed understood the implications instantly. A world full of quirks, genetic variances, was a buffet for the Clinter. If Knull assimilated the quirk factors of an entire planetary population, his army would become unstoppable, capable of threatening the 616 reality with renewed vigor. The bridge was open, but crossing it would take time. Time that the heroes of Earth MHA did not have. Back at UA, the battle had turned into a desperate retreat. The sheer number of symbiotes was overwhelming. Momo Yayorozu was creating cannons and flamethrowers as fast as her lipids allowed, but the ammunition was finite. Dark Shadow, the quirk of Fumika's Tokoyami, was in a state of berserk panic. The darkness of Knull's invasion supercharged Dark Shadow to monstrous proportions, but the entity was terrified, thrashing against Tokoyami's control. "It is the abyss," Dark Shadow shrieked, its voice distorted. "It is the source. We cannot fight the dark with darkness." Tokoyami struggled to hold back his own power, realizing that Knull's influence was turning his greatest asset into a traitor. The symbiotes sensed the kinship. They ignored the other students and lunged for Tokoyami, sensing a darkness they could subsume. It was Izuku who intercepted them. He engaged full cowl at 45%, moving faster than the eye could follow. He didn't punch the symbiotes. He used Black Whip to grab his classmates and yank them out of the path of the lunge. "We have to move," Izuku yelled, his voice cracking. "We can't win this here. We need to get to the tunnels." The realization hit the class like a physical blow. Retreat. The word was poison to their heroic education. Plus, Ultra meant going beyond. But you couldn't go beyond a tidal wave. You could only drown. Bakugo spat blood, his gauntlets smoking. He wanted to argue, to scream that he would kill every last one of them. But he looked at the younger students of Class 1B, some of whom were already crying, paralyzed by the psychic screeching of the dragons. He gritted his teeth. "Deku's right. Move, you extras. Fall back to the shelter." The retreat was chaotic. As they ran toward the main building, the ground beneath them erupted. A new type of symbiote emerged, one that had already bonded with a pro-hero. It was a twisted, venomized version of the hero crossed. The shield hero's body was encased in living obsidian armor, jagged spikes protruding from every surface. His face was gone, replaced by the white spider symbol and the spiraling teeth. He raised a shield that was no longer defensive but a buzzsaw of shifting blades. He charged at Kirishima and Tetsutetsu, who had formed the rear guard. The collision of unbreakable hardening and steel against the null-forged shield sent a shockwave that shattered the glass of the greenhouse. Kirishima's hardening, tougher than concrete, chipped and cracked under the assault. The symbiote crust was not just hitting them with force. He was hitting them with the accumulated combat experience of a top-tier hero, twisted by a murderous intent. Kirishima fell back, bleeding, his ultimate defense breached. "Red Riot," Ashido screamed, spraying acid at the monster. The acid burned the symbiote, causing it to hiss and retreat momentarily, its regeneration factor warring with the corrosion. It was a small vulnerability, a data point. Acid worked, fire worked, sound worked, but the quantities needed were massive. The sky above UA tore open further, and the central consciousness of the invasion arrived. It was not Knull himself. The God King sat on his throne in the center of the universe, but an avatar. A dark herald descends, looking like a winged angel of death. It hovered over the school, its presence freezing the air. It spoke not with sound, but by vibrating the molecules of the atmosphere. "This world is loud," the voice resonated in their skulls. "So much chaotic noise, so many useless mutations. We shall bring you the silence of the void." The psychological pressure forced half the students to the ground. This was the conqueror's haki of a cosmic scale. It was the crushing spiritual pressure of a deity. Endeavor, battered and burning with a desperate blue-white flame, streaked across the sky to intercept the herald. He was the #1 hero. The burden of the world was on his shoulders. Flashfire fist, prominence burn, he roared, pouring his life force into the attack. The beam of heat was blinding, a lance of the sun. The herald simply raised a hand. The darkness coalesced into a blade, the all-black Necrosword's offspring. With a casual, bored motion, the herald slashed. The beam of fire was cut in half. The darkness swallowed the light. The slash continued, striking Endeavor. The hero fell from the sky, a trail of blood and black smoke marking his descent. He crashed into the UA training grounds, forcing a crater into the earth. Silence fell over the campus. The symbol of power had been swatted like a fly. The morale of the resistance broke. This was the end of the Age of Heroes. The students of UA, children trained to catch purse snatchers and fight anarchists, were now standing on the precipice of a cosmic war. Izuku looked at his fallen mentor figure, then at the sky. His fists clenched so hard his gloves creaked. The danger sense had stopped screaming and settled into a low, mournful hum. It was the sound of a world dying. But in the wreckage of the tactical defeat, a strategic necessity was born. Nezu, watching the feed of Endeavor's fall, made the call he had hoped to never make. He initiated Protocol Omega. The school began to descend. UA was not just a fortress. It was a shelter designed to sink under the ground. The massive hydraulics engaged, and the 4 towers of the school began to retract into the earth, sealing the students and faculty inside a subterranean geofront. As the blast doors closed over the surface, shutting out the sight of the burning city and the bleeding sky, the darkness pounded on the roof. They were safe for the moment, but they were trapped, and above them, the surface world belonged to the king in black. Humanity had lost. The quarantine zone was total. The lights of Japan had gone out, leaving only the red spirals of the symbiotes glowing in the dark. And deep within the void of One for All, the vestiges gathered in a circle, no longer discussing how to save the world, but how to kill a god. The rules of engagement had changed from apprehension to extermination. The genre of their story had shifted from superhero action to survival horror. And somewhere in the dark, the first venomized Nomu opened its eyes, a creature of bioengineering and cosmic symbiomatter, a perfect soldier for a war that would burn the stars. The breach was complete. The assimilation had begun. 72 hours after the initial descent of the celestial barrier, the concept of day and night had been rendered obsolete within the subterranean confines of the UA. Geofront, the artificial lighting of the emergency bunkers, maintained a sterile, perpetual noon that wreaked havoc on the circadian rhythms of the 3,000 students, faculty, and refugees huddled within the reinforced strata. The air recycling systems hummed with a low industrial vibration that could be felt in the teeth, a constant reminder that the breathable atmosphere was finite and mechanically generated. Inside the makeshift command center, formerly the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee and unspoken despair. Principal Nezu sat before a wall of monitors, 80% of which displayed static, or the message, signal lost. The few surviving feeds from the surface painted a picture of a world that had been terraformed into a nightmare. The streets of Musutafu were no longer grey concrete, but were carpeted in a thick, undulating biomass that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. The buildings that had not been toppled were cocooned in webbing, serving as incubators for the new population. The silence of the grave had replaced the bustle of the city, broken only by the shrieks of the dragging beasts that patrolled the ruins. Recovery Girl operated in a state of frantic triage in the converted gymnasium. The casualties from the initial retreat were severe. Endeavor lay in a medically induced coma, his body a map of lacerations and necrotic tissue where the herald's blade had severed his connection to his own quirk factor. The wound was not healing. The darkness left behind by the blade was actively fighting the cellular regeneration, eating the stamina Recovery Girl tried to push into him. Shoto Todoroki sat by his father's bedside, his face unreadable, watching the black veins inch slowly across the number one hero's chest. The dynamic of the hero society had fractured, the invincible pillars were crumbling, and the burden of defense was shifting to children who were not ready to be soldiers. Beside Shoto, Izuku Midoriya stared at his scarred hands. The danger sense had not stopped. It had settled into a dull, throbbing ache at the base of his skull. A constant notification that the predator was directly above them, separated only by 50 meters of steel and soil. The voices of the vestiges were quiet now, huddled in the deep recesses of One for All, planning, whispering, terrified. They knew what Null was. They knew that One for All was a stockpiling quirk, a hoarding of power, and that Null was the void that emptied all stockpiles. The decision to launch a reconnaissance mission was not made lightly. They were blind. The underground sensors could detect seismic activity, but not intent. They needed to know what the enemy was building on the surface. Aizawa, his arm in a sling and his capture weapon replaced with a rudimentary grappling hook, selected the team. It was a suicide squad in all but name. Bakugo for firepower, Jiro for sonar, Shoji for sensory scouting, and Lemillion, whose permeation quirk offered the only reliable escape route if they were surrounded. They geared up in silence, the usual banter of the hero course replaced by the grim efficiencies of veterans. As the airlock cycled, depressurizing the chamber that led to the surface access tunnels, Bakugo didn't scream or spark. He simply checked the seals on his gauntlets, his eyes burning with a cold, focused hatred that was far more dangerous than his usual rage. They emerged into the ruins of a subway station in the Shibuya district. The air was cold, far colder than the season dictated, and it carried a metallic tang that tasted like blood on the tongue. As they moved up the escalators, avoiding the patches of black slime that seemed to reach for their boots, they saw the first evidence of the assimilation. The station was not empty. The civilians who had been trapped here during the initial wave were still here, but they were no longer human. They were fused into the walls, their bodies stretched and warped into biological batteries, their eyes wide and white, staring at nothing. The symbiote matter was using their bioelectricity to power the hive. Jiro clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, her earphone jacks trembling. This was not villainy. This was industrial farming. The heroes moved past the wall of the living dead, stepping out onto the street level. The sky was a swirling vortex of red and black, blocking out the sun completely. Floating in the air above the city were the Grendel dragons, circling like vultures. But it was the ground that held their attention. The enemy was building a tower. In the center of the crater, where the Shibuya 109 building used to stand, the symbiotes were constructing a spire of living obsidian that reached toward the cloud layer. It was a conductor. Mirio Togata, phasing his face through a ruined wall to get a better look, realized the purpose with a sinking heart. They were not just occupying Earth. They were turning the planet into a weapon. The spire was pulsing with the same energy signature as the hole in the sky. They were widening the gate. If that spire was completed, the main body of Knull could physically enter this dimension. The earth would be cracked like an egg. Suddenly, Shoji's dupli arms flared, eyes growing on every tip. Movement, 3 o'clock. Fast. The warning came too late. From the shadows of an alleyway, a blur of black motion struck. It wasn't a random soldier. It was a Nomu. But it was a Nomu that had been perfected by the Abyss. The High End, formerly a creature of bioengineered muscle and multiple quirks, had been coated in a venom symbiote. Its regeneration was now instantaneous. Its strength was amplified by the cosmic rage of the hive. It roared, a sound that combined a biological scream with the digital distortion of the Clintar. It lunged at Bakugo. The explosion that met it was point blank, a blinding AP shot that would have pierced a tank. The blast blew the creature's head clean off, but before the smoke could clear, the black slime whipped out from the stump, grabbed the severed head, and pulled it back into place. The flesh knit together in a millisecond. The creature laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. It had absorbed the kinetic energy of the explosion and used it to fuel its own growth. It grew larger, spikes erupting from its shoulders. "Retreat," Aizawa shouted. His erasure quirk useless against the symbiote shell that covered the Nomu's eyes. It adapts to trauma. Don't feed it energy. But running was not simple. The scream of the Nomu had alerted the hive. From the rooftops, hundreds of symbiote-infected civilians began to drop like rain, landing on all fours and sprinting toward the heroes. They were swarming. Mirio grabbed Jiro and Shoji, phasing them into the ground, shouting for Aizawa and Bakugo to follow. Bakugo launched a massive explosion at the ground to create a smokescreen, but the smoke was sucked into the lungs of the infected, who seemed to thrive on the pollution. Aizawa wrapped Bakugo in his capture cloth and swung them into the subway entrance, just as the wave of monsters crashed over the opening. They slid down the escalator shafts, sealing the blast doors behind them with a magnetic lock. The metal groaned as fists pounded on the other side. They had their intel. The enemy was invincible to standard damage, and they were summoning their god. While the scout team fought for their lives, a different catastrophe was unfolding at the Tartarus prison facility. The prison, an island fortress designed to hold the most dangerous quirks in existence, was under siege. But the attackers were not trying to get in. They were already inside. The infection had spread through the ventilation system, microscopic spores of symbiomata that bypassed the air filters. The guards in the control room were the first to turn. They didn't die. They just stopped speaking, their eyes turning black. And then they opened the cells. All of them. In the deepest level, All for One sat in the darkness. He could feel the spores trying to enter his system, but his body, modified and loaded with 1,000 quirks, was fighting back. His immune system was a battlefield of conflicting energies. He incinerated the spores that touched his skin, froze the ones that entered his lungs, and warped the ones that entered his blood. He was a fortress of one, but he was alone. The blast doors to his cell hissed open. Standing there was not a guard, but Muscular, the villain who had once nearly killed Izuku Midoriya. But Muscular was changed. His muscle fibers were interwoven with black tendrils, making him twice as large, a hulk of necrotic flesh. "Teacher," the thing that was Muscular rasped, the voice layered with the hiss of the hive. "The king offers you a new purpose. Surrender your chaotic collection. Be one with the silence." All for One laughed. "I do not share power. I take it." He unleashed an air cannon blast, amplified by kinetic boosters and spring-like limbs. The force was enough to level a city block. It hit the venomized Muscular and blasted him backward into the corridor, tearing the villain in half. But the halves did not die. They wriggled and reconnected, pulling themselves together with strands of black goo. And behind Muscular, more were coming. Moonfish, with blades of black obsidian. Mustard, breathing a gas that rotted skin on contact. The prison population had been drafted. All for One stood, floating slightly off the ground. He realized with a cold, analytical fury that for the first time in his life, he was outgunned. He could kill 1,000 of them, but there were 1,000,000 spores. He needed an exit. He sensed Shigaraki somewhere distant, but the connection was static. He was on his own. But the true prize of Tartarus was not All for One. Deep in the sub-basement, kept in a state of suspended animation, was Gigantomakia, the walking calamity, the loyal dog, the creature with the endurance to run through mountains and the stamina to fight for days without rest. The Grendel dragons had sensed him. They smelled the density of his biological power. They didn't bother with the corridors. A massive dragon smashed through the roof of the facility, tearing through 20 floors of reinforced concrete to reach the stasis chamber. It dripped its royal jelly, the purest strain of the symbiote virus, directly into Gigantomakia's feeding tube. The transformation was seismic. Gigantomakia woke up screaming, but the scream shifted into a roar that cracked the foundations of the island. His skin, already rock hard, turned into a shifting armor of vantablack plates. A white dragon symbol burned onto his chest. His size increased, the symbiote mass adding tons to his bulk. He tore the restraints like wet paper. The Grendel dragon that had infected him dissolved, merging with him, giving him wings. Gigantomakia, the walking disaster, had become the herald of the end. He leaped from the ruins of Tartarus, creating a tsunami that swamped the coastline. He didn't care about All for One. He heard a new master now. The voice of Knull resonated in his simple, loyal mind, overwriting the recording of his old master. "Clear the board," the voice said, and Gigantomakia obeyed. Back at UA, the ground shook. It was a tremor that registered on every seismograph in Japan. Nezu watched the data feed, his paws trembling. "Epicenter, Tartarus," he whispered. "The facility is gone." The screens flickered, and a satellite image, grainy and distorted, managed to push through the interference. It showed a behemoth moving across the bay toward the mainland. It was Gigantomakia, but he was unrecognizable. He was a mountain of darkness, and everywhere he stepped, the ground turned black. He wasn't just destroying, he was spreading the infection with every footfall. He was heading for the nearest concentration of resistance, Shiketsu High School. The students in the UA common room felt the tremor. They looked at each other, the silence stretching thin. The hope that the pro-heroes could contain this, that the government had a plan, evaporated. The adults were losing. The top heroes were dead or incapacitated. The greatest villain was either dead or assimilated. The hierarchy of the world had collapsed. Momo Yaoyorozu, her face pale, looked at the formula she had been working on. She was trying to create a chemical compound that could dissolve the symbiotes, based on the data from the acid attack earlier. But she needed a sample, a live sample, and she needed time. Time was the one resource they didn't have. In the Marvel Universe, specifically, in the Sanctum Sanctorum of Earth 616, Doctor Strange hovered in a lotus position, the eye of Agamotto glowing fiercely. He was projecting his astral form to the edge of the dimensional breach. He could see the MHA universe, a bubble of reality that was rapidly darkening. He tried to weave a spell of shielding, to reinforce the dimensional walls and prevent the spread. But the corruption was unlike anything he had encountered. It wasn't just magic. It was anti-life. It was the void that existed before magic. When he tried to touch the timeline to offer aid, the feedback lashed out. A tendril of psychic darkness whipped across the interdimensional gap, striking Strange's astral form. He recoiled, slamming back into his physical body in New York, coughing blood. "Stephen," Wong asked, rushing to his side. "It's quarantined," Strange gasped, wiping his mouth. "The laws of that universe are too malleable. They have no magical defenses. Knull is rewriting their reality script. If we try to open a portal to evacuate them, the infection will ride the bridge back to us. We can't let them out." "So we leave them to die?" Wong asked, horrified. Strange looked at the swirling rot in the orb of Agamotto. "We have to seal the breach from the outside. We have to lock the door and throw away the key." The sentence hung in the air, a death sentence for an entire timeline. The heroes of the Marvel Universe, the paragons of justice, were forced to make the pragmatic choice. They would not be coming to save UA High. The cavalry was not coming. Inside the UA shelter, the realization of their isolation began to set in. The communications with the outside world had totally ceased. The internet was dead. The last transmission from Shiketsu High was a scream that was cut short by the sound of crumbling stone. Gigantomakia had arrived. The destruction of the rival school was not a battle. It was an erasure. The students of UA sat in the dim light, realizing they were the last stronghold. Midoriya stood up. The trembling in his hands had stopped, replaced by a strange, deadly calm. He looked at Bakugo, then at Todoroki, Aida, and Uraraka. "We can't stay down here," he said softly. "If we stay, we starve, or they dig us out. We have to take the fight to them. We have to kill the king." "He's in space, you damn nerd," Bakugo growled, though there was no bite in it. "How do we get to space?" "We don't," Midoriya said. He pointed to the ceiling, toward the surface. "We bring him down. We have to use the spire. If that thing is the conductor, maybe we can use it to overload their connection. Maybe we can use one for all to short-circuit the hive." It was a desperate, insane plan. It relied on a fundamental misunderstanding of cosmic physics and a suicidal amount of hope. It was exactly the kind of plan that a hero makes when there are no other options left. But before they could formulate a strategy, the sensors in the command room screamed. A breach, not from the main doors, from below. The Grendel dragons were not just digging, they were tunneling through the tectonic plates. A massive claw tore through the floor of the support item laboratory. The shelter had been found. The sanctuary was compromised. As the alarms wailed and the red emergency lights bathed the terrified students in the color of blood, the second irreversible catastrophe became clear. There was no safe place left on Earth. The war was no longer about saving society. It was a knife fight in a phone booth for the right to exist. The floor erupted, and the first wave of venom nomus poured into the halls of UA, hungry for the one-for-all quirk that shone like a beacon in the dark. The siege of the bunker had begun, the sound of the world's last door being kicked in. The breach of the UA Geo front was not a stealthy infiltration, but a catastrophic structural failure that sounded like the Earth itself was screaming. The floor of the support course development laboratory, reinforced with tungsten carbide and shielding plates designed to withstand high-yield explosions, buckled upward with the force of a hydraulic press. The initial rupture sent shrapnel flying at supersonic speeds, shredding the delicate machinery and the frantic inventors who were scrambling to weaponize their prototypes. Power Loader, the faculty hero tasked with the subterranean defense, didn't even have time to fully engage his excavator rig. A massive, glistening black claw, wider than a compact car, punched through the floorboards and crushed the rig's cockpit in a single, fluid motion. The metal didn't crumple. It dissolved. The acids secreted by the Grendel-strain symbiotes were capable of breaking down molecular bonds on contact, turning the hero's armor into a slurry of grey sludge that dripped onto the unauthorized intruders below. From the jagged wound in the earth, the darkness poured in. It wasn't just the venomnomus. It was the hive itself. A flood of smaller, feral symbiotes that moved with the terrifying coordination of a single organism. They scrambled over the wreckage, their white eyes glowing in the emergency red lighting, hissing with a sound that was less like a snake and more like the static of a dead radio channel. The students of the support course fell back, firing their experimental heavy cannons. Beams of condensed light and explosive rounds struck the leading wave, tearing chunks of biomass from the creatures. For a standard biological enemy, these wounds would have been fatal, but against the Clintar offspring, damage was merely an invitation to evolve. The severed limbs of the symbiotes sprouted tendrils and pulled themselves back to the main bodies, or worse, acted independently, leaping onto the faces of the screaming students to initiate immediate bonding. The alarm sirens were deafening, a constant, rhythmic blare that made communication impossible. In the narrow corridors of the bunker, the advantage of numbers that the heroes possessed turned into a lethal bottleneck. Class 1A and Class 1B, along with the remaining faculty, rushed to establish a choke point at the junction of the academic sector. It was a kill box, a hallway designed for defense, but the enemy was not respecting the geometry of the battlefield. The venomnomus ignored the hallway, smashing through the walls as if the reinforced concrete were wet cardboard. Shoto Todoroki stood at the center of the intersection, his left side engulfed in flames. He unleashed a torrent of fire, a horizontal column of hell that filled the corridor. The heat was intense enough to blister the paint on the walls instantly. The leading symbiotes screeched as the fire consumed them, their weakness to extreme heat finally giving the heroes a momentary advantage. But the fire was also consuming the oxygen in the sealed underground environment. As the flames roared, the students behind Shoto began to gasp, their lungs burning. The ventilation system had already been clogged by the spreading biomass. Shoto realized with horror that his greatest weapon was suffocating his allies. He cut the flames, switching to ice, trying to freeze the tunnel shut. The ice glacier surged forward, sealing the breach with tons of permafrost. For a moment there was silence, save for the panting of the students and the distant rumble of the surface wall. Then the ice wall began to turn black. Veins of corruption spread through the translucent barrier like ink in water. The symbiotes were not breaking the ice, they were infecting it. The thermal regulation of the Clintar matter allowed them to adapt to the cold instantly, absorbing the low temperature and converting it into metabolic energy. The ice wall shattered outward, exploding into a shower of razor-sharp black shards that cut into the defensive line. Ejiro Kirishima and Tetsu leaped to the front. Their bodies hardened to their absolute limits. They became living shields, deflecting the shrapnel that would have shredded their classmates. But the Nomu that stepped through the shattered ice was different. It was a near high end, a creature with 4 arms and an exposed brain case that was now covered in a slick, black helmet of symbiote matter. It didn't strike them with fists. It struck them with spikes formed from its own flesh. The spikes impacted Kirishima's unbreakable form. Physics dictated that the spikes should break. Instead, they flowed around his hardening, seeking the microscopic gaps in his armor, the pores of his skin. Kirishima screamed as the symbiote needle points pierced his defense, injecting a paralytic neurotoxin directly into his bloodstream. He fell, his hardening wavering as his nervous system was hijacked. Mina Ashido, seeing her friend fall, panic-fired a massive wave of her highest viscosity acid. The corrosive liquid splashed over the Nomu and the swarming symbiotes. This time, the effect was tangible. The acid ate through the black slime, preventing regeneration. The symbiotes hissed in genuine pain, retreating from the chemical burn. "Acid!" Mina yelled, her voice cracking. "They can't heal from the acid quickly. Momo, we need more." Momo Yayorozu, already pale from lipid exhaustion, fell to her knees. She was creating cannons, shields, gas masks, and now she had to synthesize gallons of complex acid. Her body was trembling. She was not a factory. She was a teenage girl running on adrenaline and fear. I need time," she gasped. But there was no time. The ceiling of the hallway began to drip. The infection had moved into the vents above them. They were surrounded in 3 dimensions. Principal Nezu, watching the slaughter from the command center, made the final calculation. The bunker was a coffin. The probability of survival if they stayed underground dropped to 0 within the next 10 minutes. The probability of survival on the surface was only marginally higher, at 0.04%, but it was non-zero. "Abandon the shelter," his voice projected over the comms, calm but final. "Protocol Icarus. All students and faculty proceed to the vertical launch shafts. We are returning to the surface. We must break the siege from the outside." The retreat turned into a vertical nightmare. The emergency elevators were dead, their cables severed by the saboteurs in the walls. The students had to climb the maintenance ladders of the massive ventilation shafts that led to the surface fake cities. It was a climb of 50 meters in the dark, with monsters nipping at their heels. Tenya Ida, his engine stalling from the lack of oxygen and the debris clogging his intakes, carried 2 younger students on his back, jumping from gantry to gantry. Uraraka touched as many people as she could, nullifying their gravity to make the climb faster, but the nausea was overwhelming her. She vomited mid-air, wiping her mouth and continuing to float her classmates up the shaft. As they ascended, the darkness below them rose like a tide. The noise was the worst part, the chittering wet sound of 1,000 mouths opening and closing. Fumikaze Tokoyami was near the rear guard. Dark Shadow was massive now, swollen on the ambient darkness of the shaft and the cosmic proximity of Knull's influence. But Dark Shadow was weeping. The sentient quirk was terrified of the greater dark. "Do not let them touch us," Dark Shadow shrieked, lashing out wildly with claws that could slice steel. "They are the silence. They will eat the me that is me." Tokoyami struggled to rein in his quirk, feeling the tug of the hive mind trying to usurp his control. He realized that his quirk was not just a shadow. It was a dimensional window, and the thing on the other side of that window was bowing in submission to the king in black. They breached the surface exit in the ruins of Ground Beta. The blast doors blew open, and the students spilled out into the open air. But there was no relief. The air was toxic, filled with spores and ash. The sky was a bruising purple and black, the sun completely excised from reality. The temperature was freezing, and waiting for them in the center of the training ground was the vanguard. A dozen venomized pro-heroes, those who had fallen in the first wave, stood in a silent phalanx. Among them was Midnight. Her dominance quirk was now twisted. The pheromones she released were visible as purple smog that induced not sleep, but a paralyzing, nightmare-filled trance. Beside her was a twisted version of 13, the space hero. The black hole quirk had been weaponized by the symbiote, creating a swirling vortex on the hero's chest that pulled debris and students alike toward a crushing singularity. The heroes they had looked up to, the teachers who had guided them, were now meat puppets for a cosmic warlord. Izuku Midoriya landed at the front of the group, his boots cracking the pavement. Green lightning arced around him, but it was erratic, fighting against the static pressure of the atmosphere. He looked at the thing that used to be midnight. He felt the sickness in his stomach, the absolute violation of life that this invasion represented. The vestiges within him were silent, focusing all their will on shielding his mind from the psychic assault. "We have to push through," Bakugo roared, landing beside Izuku. He raised his gauntlets, aiming not at the heroes, but at the ground beneath them. "Don't look at their faces. They're dead. Treat them like villains." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was a necessary cruelty. Bakugo fired, a stun grenade blast that was blindingly bright. The flash overloaded the sensitive, lidless eyes of the symbiotes, buying them a second of hesitation. It was in this chaos that the metaphysical clash of power systems truly began to manifest. As Izuku charged, utilizing Black Whip to snare the possessed 13 and pull the vortex aim downward, he felt a sudden, cold intrusion in his mind. It wasn't the danger sense. It was a voice, deep, ancient, and amused. "I see you, little light." Knull, the god of the void, was not physically present, but his consciousness was omnipresent in the network of the hive. He had noticed the anomaly. One for All was not a biological mutation. It was a stockpiled will, a torch passed down through generations. To Knull, who existed to extinguish the light of creation, One for All was an irritation, a spark in the dark. Izuku screamed as black tendrils erupted not from the ground, but from the Black Whip quirks themselves. The symbiote hive mind was attempting to hijack the energy of the quirk. Black Whip was, fundamentally, an energy manifestation of emotional control. The symbiotes fed on emotion. They were trying to eat the quirk from the inside out. Izuku fell to his knees, clutching his head. The black energy of his own quirk turned against him, wrapping around his throat. "Midoriya!" Uraraka screamed, rushing toward him, but she was intercepted by a venom soldier. Inside the vestige world, the first user, Yoichi, stood before the encroaching tide of sludge. "You cannot have him," he stated, his voice echoing with the weight of 8 generations of sacrifice. The vestiges formed a wall of light. This was the clash, the will of one versus the hive of all. The symbiotes sought to unify all life into a single, mindless darkness. One for All sought to save individuals, to preserve the distinct future of humanity. It was a philosophical war fought with metaphysical artillery. Izuku gritted his teeth, blood leaking from his nose. He had to change the frequency. He couldn't fight darkness with anger, because the symbiotes ate anger. He couldn't fight with fear. He had to use the one thing the void couldn't digest. Pure, unadulterated altruism, the drive to save. He forced the memory of All Might's smile, of his mother's hug, of the feeling of saving Eri. He flooded One for All with F.A. Jin, building up a kinetic charge of pure hope. Detroit. Smash! He didn't punch a villain. He punched the air. The shockwave was not just wind. It was a blast of psychic rejection. The gold light of One for All flared outward, bathing the immediate area. The effect was instantaneous. The symbiotes recoiled. The connection to the hive mind was momentarily severed by the sheer intensity of the conflicting will. The black goo on Midnight's face receded for a split second, revealing her terrified human eye. She gasped, "Kill me!" before the darkness surged back. It was a revelation, but a costly one. They could hurt the hive, but they couldn't cure the victims. The realization that death was the only mercy broke the hearts of the students. Then, the ground stopped shaking and started to bounce. A rhythmic, heavy impact that threw people off their feet. Boom, boom, boom. From the smoke of the burning city, Gigantomakia emerged. The scale of the creature was impossible. The symbiote had not just covered him, it had evolved him. He was now over 50 meters tall, a kaiju of obsidian muscle. Wings, ragged and leaking shadow, sprouted from his back. His face was a featureless slate of white bone, with a single vertical maw that dripped acid. He held a chunk of a skyscraper in one hand like a club. Master. Course. The voice was a tectonic grind. Gigantomakia was no longer looking for Shigaraki. He was looking for the spire in Shibuya, and UA was in the way. The giant didn't even attack them intentionally. He simply walked through the campus. He stepped on the main academic building, the structure that had housed decades of hero history. It collapsed into dust and rebar under his foot. The shockwave of the step sent the students flying like rag dolls. This was not a fight. This was a natural disaster. Mount Lady, one of the few surviving pro-heroes who had managed to regroup, grew to her giant form in a desperate attempt to grapple the beast. She was massive, a titan in her own right, but against the venomized Gigantomakia, she looked like a child. She tackled him, trying to push him off course. Gigantomakia didn't break stride. He backhanded her with a casual swat. The force shattered her ribs and sent her crashing through 3 city blocks of the fake city. She didn't get up. "We can't fight that," Cyril whispered, staring up at the monstrosity. "We literally can't fight that." They needed a nuclear option. They needed something that defied the rules of this new world. Suddenly, a streak of red and black lightning tore through the battlefield. A figure landed on the head of the venomized Gigantomakia. It was Shigaraki Tamura. But he was not the Shigaraki they knew. He was half-formed, his body a chaotic war zone of flesh and mutation. He had woken up early from his regeneration tub in the confusion of the raid on the villain base, which had happened off-screen during the chaos. All for One was piloting him remotely, or trying to. Shigaraki placed all 5 fingers on the giant's head. Decay. The effect should have been instant. Gigantomakia should have crumbled to dust. The decay spread, turning the black armor to ash. But the symbiote matter regenerated faster than it could decay. It was an infinite loop of destruction and creation. Dust fell like snow, but the giant kept walking, annoyed but unharmed. The power of a god of destruction was being nullified by the god of the void. Shigaraki laughed, a manic, broken sound. "Cheater, you're cheating," he screamed at the sky. The distraction, however, bought the students a window. The focus of the hive was split between the ants, the students, and the rival predator. Shigaraki. "We have to go. Now," Aizawa ordered, clutching his bleeding side. "To the coastline. We need to get to the water. The symbiotes are less effective in salt water." It was a theory, unproven, based on the sonic conductivity of water, but it was a direction. As the class scrambled to retreat, leaving behind their home, their school, and their legacy, a final, horrifying variable entered the equation. All for One, the original body, had escaped Tartarus. He stood on a rooftop overlooking the UA campus, watching the fall of the fortress. He wore a stolen suit, his face a mask of scar tissue. He watched his successor, Shigaraki, flailing against the giant. He watched One for All retreating, and he watched the symbiotes. All for One extended his hand toward a passing Grendel dragon. He didn't try to blast it. He used a combination of quirks, forced quirk activation, combined with mind violate, and a newly acquired biolink from a Tartarus inmate. He thrust his will into the dragon, usually the hive mind, and crushed any intruder. But All for One was a being defined by the theft of will. He had spent a century dominating others. He didn't ask for permission. He bit back. The Grendel screeched, thrashing in the air as All for One's will viral loaded into its local control node. He wasn't taking over the hive, that was impossible. But he was carving out a partition. He was hacking the network. The dragon's eyes turned from white to a glowing, sickly red. It stopped following the song of Knull and hovered obediently next to All for One. The Demon Lord smiled. He had acquired a sample. Now he could study it. Now he could dismantle it. And eventually, he would take the throne for himself. Izuku Midoriya, All for One whispered, his voice carried by the wind. Run as far as you can. But remember, this board has 3 players now. The image of UA High finally crumbling completely. The iconic H-shaped building toppling into the crater left by Gigantomakia's footprint. The students were fleeing into the wasteland, refugees in their own country. The pro-hero society was dead. The villain alliance was fractured. The symbiote empire was rising. And in the sky, the spire in Shibuya pulsed, forcing the dimensional tear wider. A hand, the size of a continent, began to press through the breach. Knull was done waiting. He was coming to claim his new toy personally. The remaining survivors of the UA Exodus gathered at the Takoba National Stadium, a structure that had miraculously survived the initial bombardment due to its location on the edge of the bay. The stadium, once a symbol of sportsmanship and youthful competition, was now a rusted cage housing the last embers of the Japanese hero society. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rotting kelp, mixed with the pervasive ozone scent of the alien invasion. The ocean, usually a route of escape, had become a wall. The water was dark, churning with aquatic variants of the symbiotes that patrol the coastline like sharks, devouring any vessel that attempted to break the quarantine. The students of Class 1A sat in the stands, their costumes torn and stained with blood and black ichor. There was no conversation. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic thud of Gigantomakia's footsteps as the Titan patrolled the city center, guarding the spire. Izuku Midoriya sat on the edge of the field, staring at his hands. The scars on his arms seemed to ache in sympathy with the planet. The one for all. Quirk was humming, a low, constant vibration that felt less like power and more like anxiety. The vestiges were arguing. He could hear them in the back of his mind, a cacophony of ancient voices debating philosophy while the world burned. Nana Shimura wanted to fight until the end. The second user wanted to assassinate the host. But the first user, Yoichi, was weeping. He sensed something in the void that the others missed. He sensed a familiarity. The darkness of Knull was not just evil. It was the absence of light, and one for all was a stockpiled light. There were 2 sides of a cosmic equation that was trying to balance itself. Principal Nezu stood in the center of the command huddle, flanked by the few remaining pro-heroes. Aizawa, Present Mike, and the injured hawks, whose wings were mere burnt stubs. Nezu held a tablet that displayed the atmospheric readings. The data was apocalyptic. The spire in Shibuya was 90% complete. It was a biological space elevator, a tether that was physically pulling the Earth MHA reality into the Clintar hive dimension. Once the connection was solidified, the planet would be dragged into the void, and the sun would simply cease to exist for them. They had 4 hours. We have no munitions, Aizawa said, his voice a rasping shadow of its former authority. We have no air support. The students are exhausted. If we attack the spire, it will be a slaughter. If we do not attack, Nezu replied, his black eyes unblinking, the probability of survival is absolute 0. We must introduce a chaotic variable, something the hive mind cannot predict. The variable arrived not from a plan, but from a transmission. The stadium's floodlights, powered by emergency generators, flickered and died. The massive jumbotron screens, cracked and dead, suddenly roared to life. Static washed over the displays, followed by a clear, high-definition image. It was a face that every hero knew. It was a face that haunted their nightmares. All for one. He was sitting in a high-backed chair, seemingly relaxed despite the chaos of the world. Behind him, the window showed a panoramic view of the burning city, viewed from a high-rise that was actively being consumed by the symbiote matter. He wore a crisp suit, starkly contrasting with the end of the world. "Greetings, UA High School," his voice boomed across the stadium, smooth and terrifyingly cultured. "It seems we find ourselves in a rather inconvenient predicament." The students leapt to their feet, quirks flaring. Bakugo's hands smoked. Todoroki's left side ignited. The hatred in the stadium was palpable, a physical heat. "Save your energy," All for One said, waving a hand dismissively. "I am not transmitting to taunt you. I am transmitting to propose a transaction. You see, I have spent over a century cultivating this garden. I have weeded it, watered it, and pruned it to suit my tastes. I intend to rule this world, Midoriya Izuku, and I cannot rule a ball of dead rock floating in a sunless void. This alien king, he is ruining my property. We will never work with you," Ida shouted, his engines revving. "You are the cause of all this. You weaken society, and you failed to protect it," All for One countered, his tone hardening. "But let us not debate history while the sky falls. I have a dragon. I have the remnants of the Paranormal Liberation Front, and I have the location of the Spire's central nervous system. You have the raw power of One for All, and you have the girl, the one who rewinds." The camera zoomed in on All for One's face. "The Spire is biological. It is alive. If we destroy it, it grows back. But if we revert it, if we rewind the biological clock of the structure to a point before it existed, the connection snaps. My Tamura is indisposed. He is fighting a war in his own head. I need your eraser head to clear the path, and I need your deku to deliver the payload. I provide the air cover. You provide the nuclear option." The screen went black, leaving only a set of coordinates and a time. The debate that followed was vicious. The heroes were being asked to ally with the devil to kill a god. Hawks, pragmatic to the bone, argued in favor. "We are dead anyway," he said, leaning against the wall. "If he wants to help us save the world so he can try to conquer it later, let him. We can fight him tomorrow. We have to survive today." Aizawa looked at Midoriya. The decision ultimately rested on the shoulders of the boy who carried the legacy. Midoriya looked at Eri, who was hiding behind Mirio's cape, clutching a small, dirty doll. She was the weapon AFO wanted to use. Midoriya knelt down. He knew the cost. Using Eri on this scale might burn out her quirk forever, or worse, kill her. But if they did nothing, she died anyway. "We go," Midoriya said, standing up. The look in his eyes was not the bright-eyed optimism of his first year. It was the hardened resolve of a soldier who had accepted his own death. "But we don't trust him. We use him. And if he tries anything, I will kill him. I won't capture him. I will kill him." The words hung in the air, heavy and blasphemous to the hero code. but no one corrected him. The code had died with the first sunset. The assault on Shibuya began at twilight. It was a scene from a fever dream. The heroes of UA did not arrive in jets or buses. They arrived on the back of a hacked Grendel dragon. All for One had kept his word. The massive beast, its eyes glowing the red of AFO's influence, descended through the clouds, carrying the strike team on its back. Flanking them were high-end Nomus, piloted by the Doctor's remote algorithms, engaging the wild symbiote dragons in aerial dogfights. It was a war of monsters against monsters, with humanity clinging to the scales of the lesser evil. Below them, the spire pierced the heavens. It was a twisting tower of black flesh, 3 kilometers high, pulsing with purple veins. At its base, a sea of symbiotes writhed, chanting a silent prayer to Knull. The Grendel dove, Aizawa standing near the creature's neck, his hair floating as he erased the quirks of the flying enemies, causing them to drop from the sky. "Drop zone approaching," Bakugo yelled, his voice barely audible over the wind. He was strapped to Midoriya, who was carrying Eri in a reinforced cradle on his back. "Don't you dare drop her, Deku." "I won't," Midoriya yelled back. He activated Black Whip, securing his teammates. They jumped. The freefall was chaos. Aerial symbiotes intercepted them instantly. Shoto Todoroki unleashed a flash freeze heatwave, creating a massive explosion of expanding air that cleared the immediate airspace. They crashed onto the side of the spire halfway up. The surface of the tower was not solid. It was sticky, like semi-dried tar. They sank into it up to their ankles. The tower sensed them immediately. The walls opened and mouths emerged, gnashing teeth trying to bite their legs. "Run," Midoriya commanded. They sprinted vertically up the side of the tower, defying gravity with their quirks. Uraraka touched them all, lightening the load. Shoji and Sero used their limbs and tape to create anchors, pulling the slower members up. From the top of the tower, the avatar of Knull waited. It was the herald that had defeated Endeavor. It stood with arms crossed, watching the insects climb. Persistence, it mused, its voice vibrating in their skulls. A trait of the lower life forms. It raised its hand, and the spire reacted. Massive tendrils of symbiote matter lashed out from the structure, swatting at the students. Kirishima and Tetsutetsu formed a wedge, taking the impacts head-on. Their armor cracked, blood spraying, but they didn't stop. "Go! Go!" Kirishima screamed, as a tendril wrapped around his waist and began to pull him into the wall. "Don't stop for us." Midoriya didn't look back. He couldn't. This was the small choice, the choice to leave friends behind to ensure the mission. It tore at his soul, every step a betrayal of who he wanted to be. As they neared the apex, the sky tore open. The hand of Knull, which had been pressing against the dimensional barrier, broke through. It was not a hand of flesh, but a construct of pure void, miles wide. It descended toward the spire, intending to grasp the tether and pull the worlds together. All for One appeared. He didn't climb. He floated up, carried by an airwalk quirk, looking pristine. He hovered next to the herald. "You are trespassing," All for One said calmly. The herald laughed. "You are a germ speaking to a cure." All for One smiled. "And you are a battery." He unleashed a chaotic combination of quirks: rivet stab, air cannon, kinetic booster, and a space warping quirk he had stolen years ago. The attack didn't hit the herald. It hit the connection between the herald and the spire. All for One wasn't trying to fight. He was trying to sever the Wi-Fi. He plunged his red and black tendrils into the herald's chest. Forced quirk activation. He forced the herald's biology to reject the symbiote. It was a biological paradox. The symbiote was the biology. The resulting dissonance caused the herald to explode in a shower of unstable matter. All for One absorbed the blast, laughing as the cosmic energy surged through his stolen bodies. He was power drunk, high on the taste of an alien cosmology. "Now, Midoriya," All for One shouted, pointing to the exposed core of the spire, a beating heart of purple light. "The girl, now!" Midoriya reached the core. He unstrapped Eri. She was terrified, her horn glowing blindingly bright. "Eri," Midoriya said, his voice trembling, "I need you to remember the feeling of the school festival, the feeling of being safe. I need you to push that feeling into this thing. Make it go away. Make it never have happened." Eri screamed, closing her eyes, and unleashed her power. The rewind energy, yellow and warm, flooded the core. The spire began to shudder. The black flesh turned grey, then dissolved into dust. The structure was being reversed through time, deconstructed cell by cell. It was working. The tether was snapping. But then, the choice was made. The small choice that changed everything. As the spire collapsed, All for One made his move. He didn't retreat. He lunged for the dissolving core. He didn't want to destroy the bridge. He wanted to keep the receiver. He wanted the Clintar genetic code for himself. He grabbed the fading heart of the spire with his mutated hand. "No," Midoriya screamed. He realized the trap. If All for One absorbed the core, while Eri was rewinding it, he would absorb the concept of the connection. He would become the new door. Midoriya had a split second. He could let All for One take it, potentially dooming the future but saving the present. Or he could intervene. Midoriya jumped. He didn't punch All for One. He grabbed him. He grabbed the Demon Lord's arm with both hands. And he did the unthinkable. He didn't try to pull him away. He pushed. He pushed One for All into All for One. He initiated the transfer. The vestiges screamed in horror. "Ninth, what are you doing?" "He wants power," Midoriya screamed, tears streaming down his face as the green lightning consumed them both. "I'll give him everything. I'll give him the stockpile. I'll overload him." It was the theory of the singularity. All for One was already struggling to contain his stolen quirks. He was a full glass. Midoriya was pouring an ocean into him. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. One for All, the quirk of accumulated power, met All for One, the quirk of stolen power, inside a conduit of Clintar hive mind energy, while being bathed in Eri's temporal rewind. The math of the universe broke. A blinding white light swallowed the top of the spire. The sound was not an explosion, but the sound of a bell ringing, a pure, resonant tone that cracked the crust of the earth. The spire disintegrated instantly. The null hand recoiled, burned by the sudden surge of incompatible energy. The dimensional tear didn't close. It shattered. It didn't heal. It scarified. When the light faded, Midoriya and All for One were falling. They crashed into the ruins of the Shibuya crossing. Midoriya lay on his back, staring at the sky. The red clouds were gone, but the blue sky had not returned. The sky was wrong. It was a patchwork. There were stars that shouldn't be there. There were planets visible in the atmosphere that belonged to other galaxies. He tried to sit up, but he couldn't feel his legs. He looked at his hands. The lightning was gone. The hum was gone. One for All was silent. A few meters away, All for One lay in a heap. But he was changing. The symbiote matter he had tried to absorb, catalyzed by the One for All energy and the rewind, had fused with him permanently. He stood up, but it wasn't the man in the suit. It was a creature of white armor and black veins, with 6 wings of energy and a face that was a smooth, featureless mask. He looked at his hands. He looked at Midoriya. "I can hear them," the entity that was All for One whispered. His voice was no longer just his own. It was a legion. "I can hear the spiders. I can hear the mutants. I can hear the multiverse." The small choice to overload All for One had not killed him. It had evolved him. It had turned him into a living bridge between the MHA reality and the Marvel reality. He had become the avatar of the synthesis, and in the distance, through the fractured sky, something new was approaching. Not Knull. Knull had been pushed back. The door slammed on his fingers. This was something else. A silver board, riding the cosmic currents, drawn by the massive release of energy. The Silver Surfer had arrived, but he was not here to save them. He was here to judge the world that had just broken the laws of cosmic segregation. Midoriya tried to summon a smash, a spark, anything. Nothing happened. He was quirkless. He had given it all away to save the moment, and in doing so, he had created a god. The survivors of Class 1A landed around him, battered and broken. They looked at the sky, then at the new entity standing in the wreckage. "What did you do, Deku?" Bakugo whispered, horror in his eyes. "I saved us," Midoriya rasped, coughing blood. "I think." The entity raised a hand. Reality warped around it. Buildings folded like origami. Gravity reversed in localized pockets. "No," the entity said. "You didn't save us, Ninth. You expanded us." The genre had shifted again. It was no longer a survival horror. It was now a cosmic crisis. The walls were down. The MHA universe was no longer a closed system. And the things that lived in the Marvel universe, the heavy hitters, the cosmic abstracts, the eaters of worlds, had just noticed a new flavor on the menu. The war for Earth was over. The war for reality had just begun. The arrival of the Silver Surfer did not produce a sonic boom. It produced a sudden, terrifying tranquility. The roaring winds of the Clintar storm, the screaming of the dying city, and the tectonic groans of the abused Earth were instantly silenced, replaced by a hum that resonated in the very atoms of the air. Norin Rad stood upon his board, hovering 50 meters above the ruins of Shibuya Crossing. He was a figure of absolute blinding geometry, a silhouette of quicksilver that reflected the burning world beneath him, without judgment or pity. To the battered students of Class 1A, he looked like a savior, an angel sent to answer their desperate prayers. But to the entity that was formerly All for One, and to the keen tactical mind of the now quirkless Izuku Midoriya, the surfer looked like something else entirely. He looked like a scalpel. The entity that All for One had become. A towering fusion of white bone, black symbiomata, and crackling one-for-all lightning floated upwards to meet the newcomer. This new being, the synthesis, did not need to flap its wings. It simply willed gravity to ignore it. The synthesis looked at the surfer with a hunger that transcended biological need. It saw the power cosmic not as a force of nature, but as the ultimate quirk, a resource waiting to be seized. "This world is in violation of cosmic law," the surfer spoke. His voice did not travel through the air. It manifested directly in the minds of every living being in the radius, a telepathic broadcast that carried the weight of a dying star. "Your reality has been breached by the abyss. You have fused the biology of a mortal timeline with the necrosis of the king in black. The infection is critical. I cannot allow it to metastasize to the greater multiverse." Izuku Midoriya, lying in the rubble with his legs numb and his chest heaving, felt a cold dread wash over him. The surfer was not here to fight Knull. He was here to cauterize the wound, and Earth was the wound. "I judge this world, the surfer announced, raising a silver hand. Terminal. The synthesis laughed. It was a sound like grinding metal, layered with the voices of 1,000 stolen quirks. You judge nothing, Silverman. You are merely a delivery system. You have brought me the final piece of my collection. All for one Lund. He moved faster than the eye could follow, a blur of warped space and kinetic enhancement. He did not punch. He reached out with open palms, engaging the forced quirk activation aspect of his power, now supercharged by the one-for-all stockpile. He intended to steal the power cosmic. The surfer reacted with a speed that defied time. He did not dodge. He simply ceased to be in the path of the attack and reappeared behind the synthesis. He fired a beam of cosmic energy, a concentrated bolt of stellar radiation. It struck the synthesis in the back, vaporizing the wings and blasting a hole through the torso. The students cheered weakly, but the cheer died in their throats. The hole in the synthesis's chest did not bleed. It filled with gold and black light. The energy of the blast was not destroying him. It was being metabolized. The synthesis turned, the wound closing in seconds, the tissue regenerating stronger than before. Energy, the synthesis mused. Tasting the air. Delicious. You are not biological. You are a battery. The battle that ensued destroyed the concept of geography in Tokyo. The surfer unleashed the fury of a supernova. Blasts of energy that could crack planets. The synthesis countered with a chaotic storm of quirks. He warped space to redirect the blasts. He used a magnified version of Reflector to send the cosmic energy back at the source. He conjured absolute zero ice and hellfire simultaneously. It was a clash between a master of a single, infinite tool and a master of 1,000,000,000 finite ones. Below, in the crater, Katsuki Bakugo dragged Izuku behind a slab of concrete. Bakugo's arm was broken, hanging limply at his side. His gauntlets were shattered. "We have to move, Deku," he coughed, spitting blood. "This isn't a fight. It's a natural disaster. We're just ants getting stepped on." Izuku watched the sky, his eyes wide. He wasn't looking at the explosions. He was looking at the synthesis. Specifically, he was looking at the erratic spasms of the entity's left hand. The hand would clench and unclench seemingly against the will of the main body. "He's fighting it," Izuku whispered. "Who?" Bakugo asked, wincing as a shockwave shook the ground. "The vestiges," Izuku said, his voice gaining a sudden, frantic intensity. "I transferred the stockpile to him. That included the consciousnesses of the previous users. They're inside him. They're trying to stop him from the inside. That's why he can't fully dodge. That's why he's taking hits." Izuku looked at his own hands. They were empty. The lightning was gone. But the connection was spiritual, not biological. He closed his eyes, focusing on the void where the power used to be. He reached out, not with a quirk, but with a memory. He visualized the library of One for All. He visualized Nana Shimura. "Can you hear me?" he screamed in the silence of his own mind. High above, the synthesis paused. A flicker of hesitation. The surfer, sensing the opening, slammed his board into the entity's face. The impact sent the synthesis crashing down into the ruins of Shinjuku, leveling a city block. Inside the mindscape of All for One, a war was raging. The mental world was no longer the orderly vault of a bank. It was a chaotic ocean of storm clouds and black sludge. All for One's consciousness, a massive, demonic avatar, was wrestling with the 7 luminous spirits of the One for All users. Yoichi, the first user, had wrapped himself around his brother's neck, burning with a blinding white light. "Get out of my head!" All for One roared, his mental avatar swiping at the ghosts. "You are mine. I consumed you. We are the poison. Nana Shimura replied, holding back his arm. You wanted the power. You have to take the will that comes with it, and our will is to see you fall. Back in reality, the synthesis rose from the crater. Half of his face was blown away, revealing a skull of raw energy. He was furious. The surfer descended, his face impassive. Your physiology is unstable, the surfer observed. You are a chaotic amalgamation of incompatible genetic codes. You are unraveling. Surrender, and I will make your end painless. I do not surrender, the synthesis snarled. I evolve. He raised both hands to the sky. He activated every quirk in his arsenal simultaneously. Gravity, air pressure, thermal dynamics, electromagnetic fields. He began to pull. He wasn't pulling the surfer. He was pulling the atmosphere. He was creating a vacuum, stripping the ozone layer, trying to suffocate the planet to kill the biological host that the surfer was trying to save. If he couldn't have the world, he would hold it hostage. I will kill every living thing on this rock, the synthesis screamed. Give me the power cosmic, or I snap the neck of this planet. The surfer paused. He was a hero in his own way. He could not trade 1 billion lives for the death of one tyrant. He hesitated. That hesitation was what All for One needed. He launched a tendril of black slime, coated in the quirk-erasing drug he had synthesized from Eri's blood data and the captive eraser head's DNA. It struck the surfer's board. The board turned grey, the connection severed. The surfer fell. It was impossible, yet it happened. The surfer crashed into the street, his silver skin flickering. The synthesis descended on him like a wolf, pinning the cosmic herald to the ground. He placed his hands on the surfer's chest. Let's see what you are made of, the synthesis hissed. Izuku stood up. He had no power. He had no weapon. He had broken ribs and a concussion. But he saw the end of the world happening 10 meters away. Bakugo, blast me, Izuku said. Huh? Bakugo stared at him. Have you finally lost it? Blast me toward him, Izuku yelled. Use your explosion to launch me. I have to touch him. I have to wake them up. Bakugo looked at the monster pinning the silver god. He looked at the useless, broken boy who used to be his rival. And he grinned. A feral, blood-stained grin. Die, you nerd, Bakugo whispered. He placed his good hand on Izuku's back. He ignited the last of his nitroglycerin sweat. Boom! Izuku was launched like a human cannonball. He flew through the air, the wind screaming in his ears. He wasn't flying with a quirk. He was flying with physics and desperation. The synthesis was focused on the surfer, draining the cosmic energy, glowing brighter and brighter. He didn't see the quirkless boy until it was too late. Izuku crashed into the synthesis. He wrapped his arms around the entity's neck. It was a meaningless physical attack, a fly hitting a windshield. But the moment Izuku made contact, the circuit completed. The vestiges recognized the touch. The spiritual link flared back to life. In the mindscape, the tide turned. Izuku's avatar appeared, not as a powerful hero, but as the crying child he was at the beginning. He walked through the storm of All for One's hate. He walked right up to the demon. You're alone, Izuku said softly. All for One looked down at the child. I am a god. I am the synthesis. You're just a hoarder, Izuku said. And you're alone. Yoichi, Nana, Banjo, En, Hikage, En, All Might's vestige. They all let go of All for One and grabbed Izuku. They didn't pull him away. They pushed him deeper. They pushed the core of One for All, the singularity point, into the crack in All for One's soul. Get out, All for One screamed. In the physical world, the synthesis convulsed. He released the surfer. He clawed at his own face, screaming in two voices. The surfer, recovering his connection to the board, rose. He saw the boy clinging to the monster's back. He saw the spiritual struggle manifesting as an aura of chaotic light. He understood. This was not a cancer. This was an antibody. "Move, boy," the surfer commanded. "I can't," Izuku yelled, his grip tightening. "If I let go, he regains control. Do it. Do it now." The surfer raised his hand. He did not summon a beam of destruction. He summoned the power cosmic in its purest form, the power to rearrange matter. He focused on the synthesis. He focused on the seams between the realities. "I shall not kill you," the surfer intoned. "I shall unmake you." He fired. A beam of pure, silent white light enveloped the synthesis in Izuku. Pain. Absolute molecular pain. Izuku felt his body dissolving. He felt the darkness of the symbiote matter being vaporized. He felt the stolen quirks being ripped from the host, scattering like dandelion seeds in a hurricane. But All for One held on. Even as his body disintegrated, his will remained. He refused to die. He refused to lose. He grabbed Izuku's soul in the white void. "If I go, I take the legacy with me." All for One roared. He dragged Izuku toward the event horizon of the dissolution. They were both going to be erased. Then, a hand grabbed Izuku's wrist. It was not a vestige. It was not the surfer. It was Katsuki, Bakugo. Bakugo had jumped into the beam. His skin was blistering, his hair burning away. He had grabbed Izuku's arm with his broken hand. Behind Bakugo, Shoto Todoroki had grabbed Bakugo's waist with his ice. Behind Shoto, Kirishima. Behind Kirishima, Ida, a human chain of Class 1A, anchored by Uraraka, who had floated herself to reduce the drag. They were pulling. "Let go, Kachan," Izuku screamed, his voice distorting. "You'll die." "Shut up," Bakugo roared, tears streaming down his face. "You don't get to be the sacrifice. Not today." The combined will of the class, the physical anchor of their friendship, acted as a counterweight to All for One's drag. It was the ridiculous, illogical power of the shonen genre, clashing with the cold logic of the cosmic genre. And for 1 second, the shonen logic won. With a final heave, Bakugo ripped Izuku out of the synthesis's grasp. The connection snapped. All for One, stripped of his hostage, stripped of his stolen quirks, and rejected by the One for All vestiges, fell backward into the beam of the Silver Surfer. "No," he screamed. "I am the Demon Lord. I am eternal." The light swallowed him. There was no explosion. There was only a sudden implosion of space, a folding of reality. All for One was compressed into a singularity of infinite density, and then simply deleted. The space where he had been was empty. The surfer lowered his hand. The beam faded. Izuku fell onto the pavement, caught by Bakugo. They collapsed into a pile of bruised, broken teenagers. Silence returned to Tokyo. The red sky began to fade, revealing a bruised purple twilight. The spire was gone. The Grendel dragons, their connection to the hive mind severed by the destruction of the synthesis, who had been acting as the local relay, fell from the sky like stones. They dissolved into puddles of inert black sludge. The war was over, but the world was not saved. The Silver Surfer descended, hovering over the exhausted students. He looked at Izuku, who was barely conscious. "You fought well," the surfer said, "but the damage is done." "What? What do you mean?" Momo Yaoyorozu asked, stepping forward, supporting a limping Jiro. "We stopped him. We stopped Knull." "You stopped the invasion," the surfer corrected. "But you broke the seal. Your use of the stockpile energy, combined with the temporal rewind, created a resonance that echoed across the membrane of the multiverse." He gestured to the sky. The students looked up. The stars were wrong. There were too many of them, and in the distance, visible even in the daylight, was a massive, faint shape. A nebula that looked like a face. Your universe is no longer isolated, the surfer explained. It has been grafted. You are now a drift world, caught in the gravity well of the 616 reality. The walls are thin now. Things will come through. Not just conquerors like Knull, but others. He looked at Izuku. And you, young one, you are empty. I know, Izuku whispered. He felt the hollow space in his chest. It was truly empty this time. The embers were gone. The ghosts were gone. He was just Izuku Midoriya. The surfer nodded. A fair trade. A god for a quirk. He turned his board toward the sky. I must depart. I must warn Galactus that this sector is now populated. He may have an appetite for a world so rich in biological energy. Wait, Uraraka yelled. Will you help us fix it? The cities, the people. I am a herald, not a builder, the surfer said. The rebuilding is your burden. He flared with cosmic energy and shot upward, a streak of silver leaving the atmosphere in a heartbeat. The students of Class 1A were left standing in the ruins of their civilization. They looked around. The city was destroyed. The government was gone. The pro-heroes were decimated. The symbols of peace were dead or powerless. Bakugo sat up, wincing as he held his broken arm. He looked at Izuku. So, he grunted, we're stranded, in a broken world, with no powers for the nerd, and a giant space eater coming eventually. Izuku looked at his hands. They were scarred, shaking, and powerless. But he looked at his friends. They were alive. Yeah, Izuku said, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his face. We are. He stood up. It was shaky, but he stood. The wind blowing through the skeletal remains of a skyscraper. The camera pulled back, showing the devastation of Japan, the scars on the land where the spire had stood, and the dark, churning ocean. It pulled back further, showing the Earth from space, surrounded by a faint, unnatural shimmer of energy, the scar tissue of the dimensional breach, and further still, showing the shadow of something massive moving in the deep dark of the cosmos, drawn by the scent of the new world. The story of the hero school was over. The story of the survivor world had begun. The text faded to black, leaving only the sound of a heartbeat, slow, steady, and defiant. It has been 180 days since the Silver Surfer departed, and the sky has never truly returned to blue. The atmospheric composition was permanently altered by the presence of the spire, leaving a perpetual bruised twilight that hangs over the Japanese archipelago. We call it the null shadow. The rebuilding efforts are slow, hampered by the fact that the very laws of physics seem to have loosened their grip on our reality. Construction crews do not just deal with rubble. They deal with pockets of distorted gravity and solidified symbiote matter that screams when you drill into it. We have learned to use it, though. The Hatsum Corporation has already patented a new armor composite made from the husks of the dead Grendels. We are wearing the corpses of our invaders to keep warm. The Hero Public Safety Commission is a memory. In its place, the Emergency Defense Council governs, a mix of surviving pro-heroes and civilian strategists. I sit on the council now, not as a hero, but as an archivist. My quirk is gone. The embers of One for All have faded into a cold, hollow silence. Sometimes, I still reach for the lightning, expecting the familiar hum of the engine, but there is only the quiet of my own pulse. I thought I would feel less without it, but strangely, I feel heavier. The burden of the power is gone, replaced by the burden of knowledge. We know what is out there now. We know that we are not the center of the universe, but a small, leaky boat in an ocean full of leviathans. Katsuki comes by the office every evening. He does not yell much anymore. His right arm, scarred from the dissolution beam, is wrapped in a support brace that May designed. He is the de facto number one. Though we retired the ranking system, it felt childish to rank popularity when we are fighting for survival. He drops off reports on the cleanup of the Tartarus ruins. They found All for One's original body, fused into the concrete. It was empty. The synthesis took everything. Katsuki asks me the same question every night. Is it coming? He means the next one. The surfer warned us. We are a drift world now, bleeding energy into the sector. We are a beacon. I look at the monitors, the new deep space arrays we built using the data from the Spire's databanks. The stars are unfamiliar. The constellations are wrong. Yesterday, we picked up a transmission. It was not in Japanese or English. It was a binary code, simple and repetitive. We decoded it this morning. It was not a threat. It was a designation. It labeled Earth as Incursion Point Alpha. I close my notebook. Entry number 14. Title: Preparation for the Age of Galactus. We are not ready, but we are still here. And as long as we are here, we will build walls. We will train. We will adapt. The Age of Heroes is over. The Age of Defenders has begun. I look out the window at the grey horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of the damaged sky, something is hungry, and we are on the menu.